America, I'm Hugh Hewitt. That was former Secretary of State John Kerry at the Brookings Institute when he was Secretary of State in December of 2015. I'm joined now by Assistant to the President, Jared Kushner. Good morning, Mr. Kushner. How are you?
Good morning, Hugh. Great to be with you.
Thank you. Has Secretary of State Kerry called you or President Trump or Secretary Pompeo or anybody to congratulate anyone on the Abraham Accords, which he said in December of 2015 simply could never happen?
I have not had direct contact with him, but he's somebody who I'm sure is rooting for America, and I think that many people have just been very supportive about this deal. I mean, yes, on Friday we announced the third peace deal in the Middle East in the last couple of months, and very few presidents make one peace deal, but now President Trump's done three peace deals, and what we're seeing is the more that we've been able to get these deals done, the more countries want to come on board, the more people want to get past old conflicts, and President Trump has taken a different approach, not one that was looked at or thought of by the typical Washington insiders who have done this for a long time, but it's yielding results. And after years of getting criticized for doing it differently and for using unconventional people to do it, people are seeing that this different approach is one that's really working.
The Abraham Accords, as you said, in 10 weeks have produced three deals. The United Arab Emirates and Israel normalized diplomatic relations. Bahrain and Israel did the same. And then last week, Sudan and Israel did the same. Morocco and Oman are allegedly lined up over the landing field to do the same. It's a diplomatic triumph with very few precedents since the Soviet Union fell. What are the consequences, Jared Kushner? That's the most important thing. What are the consequences for the Middle East of all this diplomatic normalcy breaking out?
Well, what's incredible is my team was just over there, and they all came back saying, man, the feeling is just so much different, and this is such a bigger deal over there than people are allowing it to be over here. But the notion with peace is that it can become as big as you allow it to be. So what happened here was really barriers were broken in the Arab-Israeli conflict that had been up for a very long time, and now the people in the region are really taking hold. And it's almost like we've let a tiger out of the cage, and people are rushing to do business, to get to know each other, to visit the tourist sites in each other's countries, and to try to build the bonds that were not allowed to be built because of these artificial barriers that led in place. I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is in many ways was used by Arab leaders for 70 years to divert attention and distract from a lot of their shortcomings at home, and they used that to keep a barrier up. It was built off of anti-Semitism, and it created a lot of hatred and instability. You look at Iran, you look at they call their military the Quds Force or the Al Aqsa Brigade. You look at a lot of these jihadists in Africa and throughout the Middle East. They use the plight of the Palestinian people or the threat of the Al Aqsa Mosque being under attack in order to get younger people radicalized so they can keep their bad activities going. And what's happening now is people are able to start going to Israel, seeing that the Al Aqsa Mosque is open to everybody, and it really will, I think, reduce hostility and terrorism throughout the entire region and throughout the entire world because it brings people together. This has just been one of those core conflicts that has been exploited by bad people for half a century, maybe even close to a full century, in order to push for bad things, and this is really the beginning of that end. So, I believe that we've planted some seeds now, and I think that the short-term returns have been great, but I do believe that the long-term returns are going to be extraordinary if we keep leaning into this. And I do think there will be more peace deals. There will be more coming together. There'll be security relationships, business relationships, technology relationships, agriculture relationships, and those will even further cement the relationship between these countries and allow the Middle East to become a more stable place. The final point I'll just make on that is that if you look at from 2001 till today, you look at what China's been able to do as a country by focusing on their infrastructure, their economy. I mean, they did it in certain ways that obviously took advantage of the world, and the politicians allowed that to happen. But you look at the Middle East, it's gone backwards. So, the hope is that if they could eliminate some of these wars and instability and security risks and create the right governance structure and the right interconnectivity and eliminate these old problems, the potential for the Middle East could be one of a very exciting emerging market.
Now, Jared Kushner, you mentioned Iran in there. I'm curious, did the killing of Soleimani advance or disrupt momentum towards the Abraham Accords?
I think it helped make the Middle East a more peaceful region. I mean, speaking to a lot of U.S. military service members, they spoke about how Again, when America was negotiating the deal with Iran, they were forced to stand back and not take aggression. They said Iran knew that they were in a posture of stand down, and they really toyed with them. They would obviously, really attack different brigades, and it caused a lot of death and casualties to American servicemen that was, very avoidable had they had a posture like President Trump has had, which is, you hit us, we hit you 100 times harder. Instead, it was you could hit us and there'll be no consequence because we're going to telegraph exactly what we're going to do, which is nothing. And so, obviously, this was he was a mastermind of a lot of the terror and instability in the region, and having him not around anymore has, I think, created a much greater opportunity. You look at Iraq. We were speaking with the leaders of Iraq. They're saying that since that happened, Iran is a whole different country. Saudi Arabia says the same thing. Syria's become, a little bit better. Iraq's become more stable. Yemen's become more stable, and Hezbollah and Hamas have, much less resources thanks to the U.S. sanctions that we've put in place under President Trump, and thanks to some of the strategic leaders of these wasteful resistance movements, obviously being off the board.
Now, you also raise an interesting question about anti-Semitism driving a lot of the previous impasse. Do the Abraham Accords, already with three countries to remind the audience, with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and now Sudan, do they effectively kill the BDS movement, which needs to be killed? Do you think that this momentum has just cut the legs off of the anti-Semitic BDS movement?
Well, I think it's very hard for Europe to be more, kind of more righteous than the Arab countries on issues like this. But the reality is look, people have romanticized a lot of these different conflicts and made them into things that maybe suit their political needs. But the reality is that you have two disputes there. You have a border dispute, which is really a real estate dispute, which is, 1967, there was a war, it was a defensive war from Israel. Israel then took over the land, and basically, you have thousands of years of claims that both sides make. But, in history, there are wars, and then people resolve it. So at this point, you need to resolve, a border dispute, which is drawing a line. Both sides have two positions. A result is something negotiated. Anything that's negotiated is by definition arbitrary, and you need to resolve that. The second dispute is the Arab-Israeli dispute, which really has to do with the mosque, which I spoke about. And even you go back into the 1920s, there was a mufti named Haj al-Husseini who basically was going around the world raising money and creating instability. He was friends with Hitler and Mussolini, saying the mosque is under attack. And so what happens now is that we've tried to lay out a resolution to the real estate part of this, and I think that shows what could be realistic, where you're not displacing Israelis or displacing any Palestinians, but you need to get that resolved, and then you want to allow people to have free access to the mosque. So I think what we've done is we've almost dissected the dispute and allowed people to see, like, this is the rational framework for how we're going to resolve it. And when I was with the Sultan of Oman, Qaboos, the one who unfortunately passed away, who was a great leader, he said something to me which really, influenced my thinking on this, where he said, I feel bad for the Palestinian people that they carry the burden with them for the Muslim world. And I in reflecting on that, I said, wait, that's right. Who elected the Palestinians to negotiate on behalf of all the Muslim world for issues that pertain to the Muslim world? So, what we've done is we've gotten Israel to agree to affirm that the King of Jordan can be the custodian of the mosque, and we've tried to separate the Arab issues from the Palestinian issues, which we believe at its core is a territorial dispute. And I think that once you dissect that allows Israel and the Arab world to start coming together. Again, 3 peace deals in a short period of time is a historic achievement. Some people work in government for 30 years can never get a single peace agreement. We've done 3, and I think we have more coming. And I think what this does to BDS is it just makes it a senseless, it makes it a more nakedly anti-Semitic approach at this point, and something that really should just be eliminated.
Now, Jared Kushner, President Truman recognized Israel in 1948. President Nixon saved it during the Yom Kippur War in 1973. But I think President Trump fairly can be said, along with those two, to have been most critical to Israel because he's led the Arab world to recognize and embrace the existence of Israel. Fair statement?
I believe so. And look, President Trump, he understands American power, American strength. And what he did with the Middle East is his first trip as president was to the Middle East. If you remember the last campaign, the Middle East was a hot topic. You had basically a genocide in Syria. They were killing Christians. ISIS was running rampant. Iran was fully emboldened, funding proxies that were destabilizing the whole region. And America was still relying on the Middle East for a lot of energy. And so if you think about what President Trump did, he went to Saudi Arabia. He brought together the 54 leaders of Muslim and Arab countries and said, this isn't America's problem. This isn't your problem. It's all of our problem. And he set up a center there to combat terror finance. We've now gone into the banking systems of all the Middle Eastern countries. We've reduced the funding of terror by a dramatic amount. We opened up a counter-extremism center in Saudi Arabia. We've seen some tremendous reforms there that will help, reduce the long-term extremism and radicalization of the youth. And we defeated the territorial caliphate of ISIS, which was essential. And I think that you've seen that Iran is a different country today than they were 4 years ago by having their resources significantly hampered. And so I think that President Trump also hasn't allowed these countries to cherry pick or to look at things through a conventional lens and basically say, okay, let's agree on what the goals are. Let's all agree on that. And then let's keep iterating and working to try to find ways to get there. And so, again, over the last 3.5 years, we've been criticized. Me in particular, by all of the experts who worked on this problem set for a long time. And the reality is that we took a different approach, but it's that different approach that allowed us to achieve the different results.
Oh, Jared Kushner, when they write up the history of this, they'll say a peace breaks out in the Middle East. Experts hurt the most. The team that you just mentioned. We know about the president and the vice president, you, Secretary of State Pompeo, Robert O'Brien, but there are names like Avi Berkowitz, Captain Mark Vandroff, Brian Hook, Matt Pottinger. We know about Ambassador Friedman, but I had to look up the Charge d'Affaires in Sudan, Brian Shukin. We know about Ambassador Al Otaiba and Ron Dermer in the United States, but how many different people are involved in this? What's the team number?
We've got a great team. You also didn't mention General Miguel Correa, who was also an essential part of the team. We probably have about 15, 20 people on our team who have been working through these issues. Again, I said the other day that, peace deals are not as easy as, President Trump is making them look right now. Again, there's a lot of issues that have to get resolved. You have to build relationships. You have to build trust. And you really have to have some frank discussions. One of my favorite quotes that I used to use when I was in business, but it applies to this, is that change is like heaven. Everybody wants to go there, but nobody wants to die. And I find in politics, everyone can tell you what's wrong or where they want to get to, but then when it comes to actually making hard changes, people fall all over themselves. And
on that point, Jared Kushner, would this have happened had the embassy not been moved to Jerusalem, which was the first and most difficult choice? Republicans and Democratic presidents alike refused to do it. Was that the essential move on this chessboard?
It's hard to say in retrospect. People will write the history they do, but I do think it was an absolutely essential thing. It showed that President Trump was going to keep his word, and it also showed people that a lot of this conflict was a paper tiger. People had so much fear. The intelligence community, the people in the region, they said that if President Trump kept his promise and did it, that it would lead to war and instability like you'd never seen. And then President Trump did it, and then the next morning the sun rose, and the next evening the sun set. And life moved on. And it showed people that he was going to keep his promises, he was going to do the right thing, and he wasn't going to be bullied. And he also got some criticism from a lot of the experts who basically said that he should be getting some concessions from Israel for doing it. But President Trump said, look, A, it's a promise, and B, it's the right thing, and you shouldn't be extracting things for doing the right thing or for keeping your promises. And what he did get from that move was he got the trust of the Israeli people, and then the respect of the rest of the region. And so I guess you can say it was a very essential step.
Now, is it reversible? Is any of this reversible? Do you fear that post-President Trump, whether it's Joe Biden or someone down the road, that someone will undo all this work? Or is the momentum so significant that it has to be maintained?
Look, I'd love to think that it's all the momentum is great and this is going to be a major change in history. But, there are roots now, but everything has to be maintained and has to be watered and has to be tended to. So, I would think that anything's reversible, but I do think that the momentum we've built is strong. But I do believe that if President Trump gets another 4 years, I think the momentum will only accelerate and the results will be extraordinary. So I think 4 more years would make it much harder to be reversible, but I do think there is just tremendous momentum now around this movement. But again, another 4 years would really help cement this legacy and then make it even 10 times stronger. I do believe that if President Trump wins, Palestinians, you'll resolve that pretty quickly. You'll resolve Iran. You'll get full normalization with all the Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Oman, everybody. Because at this point, it's inevitability. We just have to keep with the strategy and not go back to the old way of doing things, which unfortunately is how a lot of the Washington people try to do it.
Now, Jared Kushner, I promised an out right now, but if you'll blow through the break, I'll ask you about the First Step Back. Do you have 5 more minutes?
Yeah, of course.
Well, then let me turn to the First Step Back because, like the Abraham Accords, it got almost no play in the debate whatsoever. It's so important. In a June 2020 assessment by the Brennan Center, which is at NYU Law School, it's very liberal. It's named for the great person. It actually has on their website an update, December 21st, 2018, 1:10 p.m. President Trump has signed the First Step Act. And in June 2020, the center's senior counsel, Ames Grobert, wrote, the First Step Act is intended to do two things: cut unnecessarily long federal sentences and improve conditions in federal prisons. More than a year after it was enacted in 2018, key parts of the law are working as promised. What's your assessment, Jared Kushner?
I think it's been a tremendous success. I mean, the First Step Act was a prison and criminal justice reform. It basically did, two things. One is it made the prisons more purposeful, right? In America, we've had a debate: what's the purpose of our prison? To warehouse, to punish, or to rehabilitate? And there's a lot of examples where you have prisons throughout the country that a lot of future criminals come from your prisons, right? The recidivism rate is too high, so it takes people in prison and it gets them job training or mental health treatment or alcoholism addiction. It helps them with reconnecting with their families or their communities, so that 7% of people who are in prison are going to leave anyway. So when they do leave, we want to give them every chance to not commit a crime again and to be productive members of society. The second thing it did was it rolled back some of the laws from the '94 crime bill that obviously was passed by President Clinton, and obviously Joe Biden was bragging about having written that bill, and that basically did a disproportionate sentencing for crack versus powder. Now, crack was more of a black drug versus powder cocaine, which is more of a white drug, and the disproportionate impact on the black community meant that a generation of black young black men really were sentenced to prison for terms that were way longer than they needed to be. And so we overturned some of that, and I think it really made a very big impact. And then 13 states did copycat legislation and followed these rules. And so this was based on what we did in Texas and Georgia, where you can both reduce your costs for warehousing people, reduce crime, and obviously, improve people's lives. So it was a tremendous success, and President Trump was very proud of it. He stood with law enforcement. Most of law enforcement fully endorsed this, and it's a great legacy item that I think is great for the country. It makes our system more fair, our country better off because of it, and it really is just a great success.
Now, this is the first time I've ever talked to you on air, Jared Kushner. I've only talked to you twice before off air because I was opposed to the First Step Act. I had my reasons, and you called me, and then you worked those. You called me back and said, we fixed that, and then I support. Did you do that with a lot of people? I mean, how much time did you put into the First Step Act?
I put in a lot. Look, people say Washington's broken, but the reality is that our founding fathers were brilliant in the system they created, and to get a law passed, it shouldn't be easy, right? You have, you have congressmen and senators from all over the country. You have advocacy groups. You have, people with opinions, and everyone weighs in. And sometimes you have to fight misinformation, and sometimes you have imperfection. And so, when we were doing the legislation, it died about 50 times. But every time it would die, it would be because a strong stakeholder had an objection. And so, obviously, you don't want to water it down that it becomes nothing. So you have to negotiate back and forth. But the point you were raising, I thought was actually a valid point. It was a concern that some people had, which was based on a turn of the draft as it was negotiated, and so I wanted to call you, get your perspective on it, and we were able to get both sides to agree to fix the problem that you thought existed in the law. So again, just because somebody's criticizing it doesn't mean that person's bad. Those people may have valid points of view, so you have to remain flexible and open-minded. And I think the biggest thing we were fighting there too, was obviously some people had valid points like you did, but some people also had misinformation. Like, we had people criticizing us saying, well, this is going to let murders and rapists out of prison, early. And I basically would try to, I mean, some people you just couldn't reason with. I say, wait, what part of you thinks that this is, the strong law and order president who fully backs law enforcement, wants safe communities? What makes you think that he's agreeing to do something that's going to allow rapists and murderers and child molesters out of prison? That's not what this legislation is intended to do, and it's not what it does. And so we were fighting back against that misinformation. But ultimately, and again, there are some criminal justice reforms that we don't support, right? Anything, if taken to too much of an extreme, could be a bad thing. But the reality is that we were able to do things that made sense. They were tried and true. I think they've both allowed people to have second chances, which, we believe in second chances and redemption. And people shouldn't be judged by the worst mistake they ever make. And I think that what this allows people to do is to get back to their communities and their families and hopefully have a real second chance. But it will lead to lower crime, and it will also lead to lower costs to the taxpayers by not having to pay for people to be locked up in prison who we don't have to be paying for. It's expensive. It could be about $35,000 a year. You could send somebody to college for that amount.
My last question, Jared Kushner. I want to go very high with this, 30,000 feet, and it's back to the Abraham Accords. The very first lecture I heard in college, and you may have had Stanley Hoffman too, was about the Melian dialogue and the fact that diplomacy it doesn't really exist. There's only power relationships. Dr. Kissinger believes strongly in diplomacy. After you've done this, you've just given a sort of standing ovation to the framers on legislation. Does diplomacy actually work, or is it always really the Melian dialogue, the powerful dictating to the less powerful?
Well, I don't think it's one or the other, right? Doctrines are complicated because it's really about application, right? So, when I was in one of the countries, on my first tour, my first year was really about listening more than it was about lecturing, right? And so I was really trying to understand why this had failed, what people's perspectives were, what we could do differently, and how we should resolve this conflict. And, one of the leaders said to me, Jared, I think you're going to make peace here. I said, well, why do you think that? And he said, well, the U.S. usually sends, one of three people to the region. People who come and fall asleep in meetings. You have people who come and read note cards, and have no ability to react. And then you have people who come here and try to convince us to do things that aren't in our interests. And, what you've done is you've come here, you've listened, you're trying to get our perspective. And, I was always a big believer in the win-win deals. And I think that, if you do this the right way, you can build trust. Not everything has to be transactional, tit for tat. You don't have to keep a balance sheet. You have to be saying, what can I do to further our interests? You have to build trust. You have to be able to work together, and you have to figure out how do I create a win-win scenario where all sides do better. And I think that is achievable. So I guess it's the reality is America does have a lot of power, and you have to obviously work with that, but there's also a notion of you have to build trust and do diplomacy. So I'd say it's probably a combination of those two things.
Jared Kushner, assistant to President Trump, thank you. Good luck in the closing 8 days of the campaign, and congratulations on the Abraham Accords. There are going to be books written about this for decades to come. You've done a great, good thing. Thank you, Jared Kushner.